Awesome. So the both of you, one is in fourth, one's in fifth, so we can just focus on those years. And if you guys have any questions or comments or anything, I'm here to answer them. Like I said, it's super personalized today. So this slide is just advertising the classes that we offer here at Kweller Prep. Because the students are younger, these classes are entirely in person, so no Zoom classes. And the exams are in the spring months of April and May, so tutoring, the classes begin right after the holidays in January. So you guys can screenshot this if you need it. I'm sure it's going to be available over email. And then I'm just gonna skip all of this stuff because it's a sample of a third grade test, and we'll just run to fourth grade. So all the exams, third, fourth, and fifth grade are structured similarly. There's reading passages that are entirely multiple choice at first. So I tried to pick a sample of one that like this, where it's entirely multiple choice. And then there's reading passages where there's short answers. And then there's a reading passage with an essay as well. I think I left that into the fifth grade test. And then for the math exam, it's similar. There's multiple choice. And then there's also short answer for the math where they want students to show their work. And sometimes there's even like long form where they actually have to explain how they got to their answer. And the same is true for the fifth grade test and the third grade test. So what I'll do is I'll start going through some of these questions with you guys, sampling the passages, giving you guys commentary on what's common, what's uncommon, to kind of guide your expectations as your kid is taking on this journey. And since you have kids in the fourth and fifth grade, you're probably familiar with the third grade and exam. So it's not that much different, but just a level up. And then about halfway through the webinar, maybe in like 20 minutes, I'll switch to the fifth grade. And then we'll do that for about 20 minutes, and then I'll try to leave the last 5 to 10 minutes for questions. Okay, so in my experience, the third, fourth, fifth grade tests are extremely important because they're setting up the students to have proper reading comprehension skills and obviously proper math questions. And it's important because later on standardized exams like the SHSAT or the SAT will continue in a similar format. So it's important that students kind of get exposed to this early and are comfortable with this kind of style of testing as early as possible. So the way that I teach these exams is very similar to how I teach my SHSAT kids or my SAT kids. The first thing that I always say is to read the directions or the little blurb. Usually for these exams, there's not much information that's kind of given to us in those blurbs, but I try to motivate the students to do that to kind of put them into that habit early, because once they move to later testing like SHSAT and SAT, those blurbs actually have valuable historical context that's relevant to the passages. So these directions just tell us to read this article and then answer questions 1 through 6. And language is also important. So now we know that it's an article rather than read this story or whatever else they may call it, read this poem. So it also kind of formulates the kind of passage that we're going to be reading. The other thing that I always teach my students is to read the title. So the title kind of provides us the first insight into what the topic is and what the main idea is. So this is Fabulous Fathers. Okay, and then after that, we go on to read. When I do reading comprehension with my kids, I always try for them to emphasize a few things. So one is we're reading for comprehension. So one aspect of it is just understanding what you're reading, making sure that you understand vocabulary, context, those kinds of things. Another important thing as you're reading is to think about the tone. So is the tone positive? Is the tone negative? Oftentimes, I teach my students to look at the adjectives and try to put little positives or negatives on top of the adjectives to see if the adjectives are positive connotated words or negatively connotated words. So tone is another important aspect of this. And then 3 is like style. So this goes into how it's written. So for example, right off the bat, we can see that this passage or article has subtitles. So that's part of style. Also, the type of language used is part of style. So language, structure, all of that goes into style. Oftentimes I do perspective. Perspective is part of this also. So I teach students what first author, second author, or third author perspective is. So basically, who is telling, right? Who is narrating this piece of work that we're reading? Um, and then the last thing that helps is punctuation. So if there's a lot of question marks, rhetorical questions, if there's a lot of exclamatory remarks, that can help us understand the tone of the writing as well. So that's just a very basic overview of general reading comprehension themes that we try to teach for students to then take these themes and incorporate them as they're reading. Now, I'm also really big on teaching students how to annotate as early as possible. So annotating, I didn't properly introduce myself to you guys, but I'm finishing up my 4th year in med school, and annotating is something that pushed me through, like went through, it's a skill that helped me even in graduate school. And I imagine that it'll help me in my professional career as well. Anytime I read any sort of article, I annotate. And it's a skill that was instilled into me early on, back when I was in grade school. So I always try to pay it forward and teach the kids that I tutor now about annotation. I think a lot of times annotation, students get very kind of bogged down with it and they don't understand the purpose of it. They try to underline everything. And I try to teach from the perspective that there's no one right way to annotate. The purpose of annotating is that you restructure whatever you're reading in a way that makes sense to you. So for me, I usually use, like, I try to square the names of people, because when I'm taking a multiple choice exam and the exam asks me about a person, instead of having to go back into the passage and skim and look, I can just go through my boxes. So I box names. I have another system for dates. I usually do like a wiggly line for dates. I underline just as I read because it helps me maintain focus, but the underlining doesn't really mean anything. I just underline whatever I think is important. And this skill kind of comes the more you practice, you get a better understanding of what's important because you get more used to reading questions and figuring out what they like to test. So I'm very sort of like hands off, no pressure with, there's no right way to underline. It's okay if you underline something that I didn't, or I underline something that you didn't. So this is the space for students to kind of learn their own style, and purpose of annotating, because it has to be helpful to them. Okay, so that's kind of the whole spiel on reading comprehension, which is applicable to any reading exam they take, but we try to instill these skills as early as possible, so starting with these grade exams. So with those big themes in mind, let's go ahead and try to read this passage together, and then tackle some of the questions. Okay, so it opens up with fathers come in all shapes and sizes. In the animal kingdom, fathers have some fascinating and strange ways of helping their young. Some animal dads protect their babies, some provide food, some teach survival skills. So looking at just this first paragraph, first, we see that the way that it opens up is all shapes and sizes. So, and then it transitions to in the animal kingdom. So we understand now that we're not just talking about human fathers. So it gives us sort of a direction. And then we notice some positive words, right? So fascinating is a positive adjective. That's a good thing if something's fascinating. Helping is a good thing, positive. Protect is another positive. And then they also define survival skills. So survival skills are skills needed to stay alive. So that's one thing to notice so far. The tone is positive, and we have a more specific direction of what kinds of fathers this article is going to tell us about. And then I would also point out this part, this little parenthetical remark, and strange with an exclamation point. So this also tells us a little bit about the tone. It tells us that it's quite informal, that it's a little bit like funny and strange, and exclamatory remark in the middle kind of establishes the tone of what we're reading as well. And then we have whatever their talents, the following fathers are fabulous. So again, a very positive remark and an exclamation point, which all gears us towards that positive tone. And then we understand that all the following are going to be examples of fabulous fathers. So all of this is an example of a fabulous father. So suck them up and spit them out. Most fish do not live in family groups, but in the red devil cichlid families of Central America, fathers help take care of their young. So this is one example of something that I would box, because if a question asks me about that, I could just run and find it very quickly instead of having to skim and look for it. And then I would also box the location Central America in case they ask about that. If a little one swims too far away, it's his dad's job to put him back into place. He gently grasps the wandering fish in his mouth and anapui. He spits out the young wanderer back with his brothers and sisters. So the way that I would annotate this is under this paragraph, I would write a fish, right? This is a fish father. And then notice the themes or the patterns that continue as the passage goes on, right? We had 2 exclamation marks. We have another one. We have this like strange onomatopoeia type, which is a literary device that we'll teach. And apui, like onomatopoeia is when word sounds like the sounds that they produce. So for example, bang actually sounds like something falling and making a bang, or boom actually sounds like something booming and exploding. And apui is meant to like mimic the same sound of spitting out this fish. So we have this kind of literary device as well. So the theme continues in that it's positive and it's rather informal. Now we have, excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. If you were Darwin's frog father with 20 to 30 babies to protect, where would you keep them? In your throat, of course. So again, here we have a kind of silly question and then an answer with an exclamatory remark again, just repeating that same theme that I established earlier about informality and kind of lighthearted or positive theme. The South American dad picks up the young ones with his tongue and slides them through slits in his vocal sacs. As the babies grow, they push on dad's throat and prevent him from croaking. Finally, when the babies are big enough, they crawl out of dad's throat and hop away. In case you are wondering, there are times when dad accidentally swallows one. Oops. So again, it continues on the same theme. And then here I would just annotate for myself, frog. The next one, piggyback nursery. Where does the mother giant water bug lay her eggs? On the father's back. So notice the same pattern, right? Each paragraph has very similar patterns. We have this question, and then we have an exclamatory answer. She attaches the eggs with a sticky material called an egg pad. When she's done, the father swims away and does all the caregiving. He visits the water surface so the eggs can get air and uses his hind feet to clean the eggs. Once the babies are on their own, the father rubs off the sticky egg pad. So this is water bug. So because oftentimes these passages are long, I recommend some form of annotating on the side just for the students to remain engaged and for them to kind of remember what it was that they were reading about. And we've got 2 more paragraphs. Cold feet, big heart. In the chilly Antarctic, a mother emperor penguin lays an egg. She must find a warm place for it before it freezes. Dad to the rescue. The pair works carefully to roll the egg to the top of his feet. He covers it with a flap of thick belly skin. The mother penguin then leaves for 2 months. She travels to open hunting waters that are over 50 miles away. In the meantime, the father keeps the egg on his feet. He doesn't eat, he doesn't drink. He just huddles together with the other fathers to keep their eggs warm. When the egg hatches, the chick stays cozy in the same place on dad's feet under a layer of skin. Soon after, the mother returns and takes over while the dad then goes hunting. And then finally, Sky Teacher. For the red fox, raising babies is a team effort. The mother stays in the den to keep the young, called kits, warm. The father brings the mother food every 4 to 6 hours until the kits are old enough to roam around. To teach them how to find their own food, the father red foxes bury extra meat near the den and hide it with twigs. And then we have this table with more fabulous fathers. So they give us 1, 2, 3, 4 examples, and with the father's unusual actions. So after we read a passage like this, it's quite overwhelming for usually a fourth grader because it's quite long. So there's a lot to keep track of. What I try to teach them to help them is noticing patterns, right? So pattern recognition is a huge part of being a successful test taker. So noticing patterns is really important. So why would they include a table like this? More fabulous fathers, and then they split it by animal and father's unusual action, because likely that was very similar to the pattern that they established in each of the other paragraphs. So we already have all the animals. That's our own annotation on the side. So when they're asked questions about each one of their animals, we should think about the unusual actions, the details of which would then come out of those paragraphs. Like, for example, the father penguin keeping the infants in on his feet. That would be the unusual action for the penguin. So in general, that's usually how I would teach a student to read and pick out those patterns, which are obviously a lot easier and comes naturally to me, not only because I'm older, but because I've been tutoring, but just instilling those kinds of themes into them as early as possible. So that was just reading. Now let's just take a look at some of the questions. So we have fathers come in all shapes and sizes. In the animal kingdom, fathers have some fascinating and strange ways of helping their young. How does the author support the information in these sentences? So we want to, how does the author tell us this? How does the author prove this to us, right? So the answer is that the author shows all the different animal fathers and the different ways that they help their young. So another thing that I always try to teach my students is, before you look at the answer choices, formulate an answer yourself to the question. And once you have that answer in your mind, pick the choice that most closely resembles the answer that you've already thought of. So that answer is choice D, by showing that father animals use different ways to care for their babies. That's exactly what each paragraph does. It goes through different types of father animals, and it tells us the different ways that they care for their baby. Now, I also really think that it's important to teach students how to eliminate wrong answers. So this kind of answer, large and small fathers, this is what I call a too specific kind of answer choice. It's a trick answer choice, right? Because they say all shapes and sizes, some students will be like, oh, shapes and sizes, large and small, that must be the answer. So this is oftentimes a way that they trick you. It's a choice that's too specific and too literal. So we teach our students to avoid those kinds of pitfalls. And that's not true for the remainder of the passage. They weren't focusing on the size. It's not just that there's fathers that are small and young. The focus is more on how they help their young, or how they care for their young. So A is no good. B, by explaining that father animals can appear unusual. So this is another one that is just off topic. Although may or may not be true, that's not what the rest of the passage focuses on. So that one is probably trying to trick you based on this table. But all the other paragraphs, it's not just that they are unusual, it's about how they care and help for their young, which is the main idea, which is established very early in this passage and in this very first sentence that they're telling us as well. So this is no good. And then C should be the easiest for students to eliminate, because it's not relevant. It's not something that that they really touched on at all. So that one could be easy to eliminate. Okay, so the next question is asking us which statement supports a main idea found in both paragraph 4 and 6. So for this is we would have to go back and find paragraph 4 and 6. So 1, 2, 3. So paragraph 4 was about the water bug, and paragraph 6 is about the fox. So let's find the similarity. In the water bug, she lays the eggs on the father. And then in the fox, the father brings the mom food. So in both cases, it's showing how the fathers are using their bodies to protect their babies from the young. In the water bug example, it's because the egg was actually laid on them. Okay, the next one, what does the word flap mean? So this is a very common question style. They often ask about what a specific word means. And this same question style is repeated in later exams like the SHSAT and the SAT as well. So it's important to introduce this kind of thinking early. So first we go back to paragraph 6 and find the flap. So the pair works carefully to roll the eggs. He covers it with the flap of thick belly skin. So usually my advice here is repeat the way that it's used. So flap of thick belly skin. And replace each one of these answer choices into that phrase to see which one makes sense. So box closing of thick belly skin does not make sense. Piece of fabric of thick belly skin is better, but still kind of awkward because how can thick belly skin also be a piece of fabric? Loose covering of thick belly skin, that makes sense because he's covering the babies with thick belly skin. So the best answer here is choice C. Okay, so for the interest of time, I want to move on and show you guys a different type of question. This is what the multiple choice is generally like. If there's a table, they will usually ask a question about it. So I often teach students to really pay attention to the table. The main idea will always be a question, so that's always something that you should prepare for as well. So that's kind of the overview of the kind of multiple choice that we can expect. I also want to show you guys what a short answer question looks like. So importantly, these are graded out of 2 points. So the goal is for the students to get a 2 out of 2, right? Response. So the features of a 2-point response include obviously following directions. So this question is asking us to use 2 details from the story. So we have to use 2 details of the story. So first they want evidence of analyzing the text. Sufficient number of details. And grammar matters, so complete sentences. So this teaches students no run-ons. Here we also review how to properly punctuate. So we review commas, semicolons, periods. And then analyzing the text, this is another way of saying actually answering the question. So sometimes students have a really great response, but they don't actually answer the question. Um, and obviously, if you don't follow their instructions, if you only use one detail, automatically your score goes down to a 2. Now, it's also important to know that there's also an essay exam as well. So that's another thing to prepare for. That is graded out of a total of 3 points. So a lot of students have difficulty with how to begin the passage or the answer. So usually I usually begin by restating the question. So you can say the information in paragraph 1 of the fox and the crow helps the reader understand the story by, right? And then you give your answer, right? By giving an overview, by telling the reader why the fox tricked the crow, by blah, 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 blah. Then I would use a quote. So I would say, in the text, it states, and then you put in your quote, and then that counts as your direct detail. And then you have one sentence where you explain or elaborate on that quote. Like, why did you pick that quote? How does that quote demonstrate your answer? And then you would say, the text also states, and then that's your second detail. And then you would elaborate on that. So this shows ... And then in the end, I repeat the beginning. So this is how the first paragraph helps the reader understand. Or in conclusion, this is how. So not specific to this question, but I'm trying to give an overview of a good response, of a good structure that students can memorize and get used to so they're not overwhelmed on test day, and that they're able to properly synthesize an answer to the question because the structure already exists in their minds and they just have to fill in the actual answers. And then, of course, we do all of this with proper grammar as well. So that's an example of what a short response will look like. Now to just run through some of the math that students can expect on the exam. So Julia moves the arm of a spinner 1 degree at a time 45 times. How many total degrees does Julia move the arm of the spinner? So for questions like this, a lot of them are considered like word types of problems. So I try to teach students how to translate the words into a mathematical operation. So it's 1 degree at a time, but she does it 45 times. So 1 degree times 45. So I teach students, well, 1 degree at a time, one time is just 1 degree. 1 degree at a time, 2 times is 2 degrees. 3 times is 3 degrees. And you realize that the pattern is you have to multiply by the number of times. And that will give you your answer, which is just 45. The next one is testing students' understanding of mathematical vocabulary. So to get this one right, you have to understand perpendicular. So we teach perpendicular versus parallel. So this is just about educating students on definitions and what those look like visually. So a lot of times students know what the word means in words, but they have a hard time connecting to what that means visually. So perpendicular means that the lines cross each other, they intersect or cross each other at a perfect corner angle, right? They form a perfect corner angle. And we teach them that that angle in mathematical degrees is 90 degrees. And oftentimes I teach students that the way you can tell is when the lines intersect, there's a little square at all their intersection points. And that's how you know that the lines are perpendicular. Versus parallel will be two lines that look like they will never intersect, never cross. So they go infinitely in each direction. So this example is an example of parallel. They go infinitely in each direction and they never cross. Another example can be the ground in a rectangular section. So I always try to teach students to draw out pictures also. So ground in a rectangular section, so I'll draw a rectangle, has a length of 24 feet and a width of 12 feet. And they want the area in square feet. So for students to understand area, we have to understand that area represents all this space inside here. And just like in a multiplication table, like you can do, if when they learn their multiplication tables, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, that's 1, that's 2, that's 3, that's 2, that's 4, that's 6. It's similar, right? So to get the total amount of space here, we have to multiply this by this. So this is really testing students' ability to multiply 24 times 12. And oftentimes I try to teach students not to get overwhelmed by making calculations like this. And I'm really big on teaching students about mental math and estimation very, very early in their sort of academic careers. So how do we tackle something like this? So one way is obviously just to multiply it out, right? So we can follow the rule and do, well, 2 times 4 is 8, and 2 times 2 is 4, and 1 times 4 is 4, and 1 times 2 is 2, and we can add it up. So that way is perfectly fine. But I want students to be comfortable with a few things. First of all, I'm multiplying 24 by 12, right? So I expect my answer. Something really easy is multiplying 24 by 10. So I expect that answer is 240. I'm multiplying by a number even greater than 10. So I'm expecting an answer that's even greater than 240. So the only one that has that is choice D. Everything else is less than 240. So I know that none of those can possibly be the answer. Another way to think about it is the unit rule. So I teach students that you can just multiply the last two numbers, 4 times 2, which is a lot easier for them than 24 times 12. And we know 4 times 2 is 8. So I know that my answer has to end in the number 8. And again, only choice D does that. Only choice D ends in 8. So those are 3 different ways that you can get to the right answer. And I also like teaching students to redo the question in multiple ways when they have extra time to prove to themselves that it's the correct answer. It's a way of checking your work. So in the interest of time, I want to move on to one of the short answer questions. So let's do number 40 together, for example. It gives us this diagram, and it says that they add ray BD to create straight angle ABD and new angle CBD. So again, this is testing us on our understanding of vocabulary and geometry. We have to know that a straight angle is 180 degrees, and we have to know what a straight angle looks like. And like what it's named for, straight means just a straight line. So when we add this line to create a straight angle, we imagine that this line looks something like that. And we can label this BD because that's what they tell us, right? Ray BD. And angle CBD now becomes this piece. This is what we're looking for. And now I know that this total is 180 and this piece is 143. So how do I get what's missing? We have to subtract. So to show your work, we would then have to say 180 minus 43. And then we just have to show our work for that subtraction. So I can't take 3 away from 0. So I borrow and I get, sorry, excuse me, 10 minus 3, which gives me 7. And then 7 minus 4 gives me 3. And then the 1 just drops down. Oh, sorry, the 1 goes away. So we end up with 37 degrees. Okay, so that was a big overview of the math and reading of the 4th grade test. I want to just scroll past the 5th grade test and maybe just reiterate some concepts and review some of those questions with you guys, and then I can take questions um, or answer anything that you guys are interested in. So as we can see here, it changes, right? Read the story. So it's a very subtle change from the previous one, which said read this article. But that's why I teach students to look at that, because that subtle change kind of prepares you for the kind of genre that you're going to be reading in. So another big thing that we do is we teach students about different genres, how to read the different genres, and what to expect. So the first article that we read was an article, like they called it, and those pieces are extremely structured. So we teach about the structure of the article, where there's a clear main idea. And then there's paragraphs that are all similarly structured. So they all have kind of their own sub-main idea, or what we call a topic sentence. And then they have supporting details that support that agenda. So obviously the real lessons will be much more detailed, but this is the kind of overview that we give students on what to expect from an article. In contrast, a story is very different. To read a story, we have to understand characterization. So we're going to be introduced to different characters, and we have to see how the characters develop and change over time. We're also introduced to a plot. We also have a climax in a story. So all of those are different components of a story that students have to keep in mind and think about as they're reading this kind of passage. Now, remember I told you that oftentimes there's a blurb. So those blurbs are more common on the 5th grade test. So I highly recommend students to read it because it provides some extra context for us. So first, we understand something about the setting. It seems like we're going to be in West Africa, so setting is also extremely important in stories. I'll add that to our list. And they define the harmattan for us, which is a dry, dust-filled wind. And then anytime an essay or something is noted as an excerpt, that's another kind of piece of evidence that I'm going to be reading a story, because it's just a piece of the story. That's what an excerpt means. And it's an excerpt from a scrap and a robe. Now, before even reading this, we can also see that there's a lot more of these boxes with words that they define for us. Because the passages are higher level, because this is now 5th grade versus 4th grade, they use more language that needs to be defined. And the passage is also a little bit longer. So we can see that this one is over 2 pages, about 2.5 pages. The other thing we notice is because this is a story, there's a lot of quotes involved and characters talking to each other. So that's kind of how we can suss out the kinds of ways that the characters are developing. So these are just things to note from a different type of passage and from this more difficult or higher level 5th grade exam. In terms of the multiple choice, it's often very similar types of questions. They again focus on theme, which is kind of the counterpart of main idea for an article. They ask about specific phrases. They ask how the author develops ideas, point of view. So all of the themes of what they ask are pretty similar. I would say just the level of the text is what is different and what gets a little bit more difficult. And I would also say that there's a few more inference questions on the fifth grade exam. Inference questions are notoriously harder because they're not specific, they're not details, right? We can't just point it out and say, well, that's a detail and that's how I know that's the answer. They create an extra step where you have to read between the lines and go one step above just pointing out the detail. So the inference questions are more common on the higher level fifth grade exam as well, because the difficulty of those is higher. And usually with the inference questions, what helps a lot is noting the tone and the kind of adjectives, the connotations of the adjectives. So this is what I was talking about earlier, whether it's positive or negative. And to teach students connotation, a big example that I always use is, let's say, the word visitor, right? So the word visitor, by definition, means somebody that's in your home that probably doesn't live there, right? Somebody's visiting you. But if I want to very subtly make that word more positive, I can call somebody a guest, right? So if I say somebody is a visitor versus somebody's a guest, it doesn't make a lot of difference for the definition of what I'm actually communicating, but there is a subtle change in my tone. When I say guest, automatically you assume something positive. I invited this person in, they're my guest, right? Versus they're just my visitor. And then an obviously very negative turn is if I call somebody an intruder. Now, by base definition, it's still pretty similar. It's somebody in my home that doesn't live there, but intruder is obviously much more negative. So this is a dramatic example, but this is what we use to kind of think about adjectives and think about how the author is using and how the author chose the types of words that they chose to include in their essay. And when they're positive, for example, we can eliminate all the negative choices like tense and distracted, silly and foolish, those are negative. Or if they're negative, then we can then eliminate the positive choices. So that's how using connotation of adjectives can help us with these sorts of inference questions. And then if we scroll continuously here, again, notice the subtle difference. This is an article. Again, that would automatically change the kind of framework in the student's mind as they are reading this, because it's going to be a different type of story or essay. And again, notice that the passages maintain their length, right? Because this is the fifth grade exam, it's still 2.5 pages, excuse me. And still the multiple choice questions are pretty similar as we keep going. Oftentimes there's at least one science passage, so we can see that this is an article from NASA. So this is an example of that. And there's some sort of diagram. So we saw in the fourth grade test tables, if there's no table, if there's no passage with the table, there will be a passage with some sort of diagram for the students to interpret. And then we also see how is this word used, or what does this word mean? Again, that style of questions is maintained throughout all the grade exams. Poetry, I usually do not see poetry, or you could see poetry along the third, fourth, and fifth grade exams actually, but they become obviously more difficult. So the fifth grade exam features a poem always, and it's more higher level or more difficult to read. We do entire classes dedicated to poetry, which I don't want to cover here in the interest of time. But we teach about literary devices used in poetry, different styles of poetry, structure, rhythm, symmetry in poetry. So all of that helps students kind of comprehend poems better. And here's an example of a short answer question. Again, the structure is the same, so they'll ask you to use details from the poem, and the format of answering the question can also stay the same. So once students are taught it in third grade, they can use that same format fourth grade and fifth grade, but just elaborate on the way they analyze the writing and the way they synthesize their response as their vocabulary and comprehension gets better. But the overall structure is the same. So you would restate the question in your opening line, and answer the question, and then pick a quote from the poem or passage to refer back to as one detail, explain that quote, second detail, explain that quote, and then a concluding sentence to tie it all together. And same exact thing here. Same exact structure. As you see, all these questions have all the same exact structure. And commonly, a lot of the things that they will explore are similar to what they would explore if it was a multiple choice. So they ask about theme or main idea or comprehension questions. So as we keep going, there's just more of the same. I want to show you guys what the long essay looks like because we didn't get to that from the fourth grade test. So usually the essay will cover two different articles. So when that's the case, you must use details from both articles to get full credit. So that's really important. And then you have to follow the rest of their sort of guidelines. And for the essays, we teach the students about the structure of writing a good essay. So we teach about like an introduction paragraph and how you begin, how an introduction must start with a hook, and then you must have a thesis in your introduction, and then each body paragraph is going to have a topic sentence, and your thesis is going to answer the questions and say the authors from both articles support the idea that dogs are providing a helpful, that dogs are helpful by. And then, so you restate the question, that's your thesis, and then by, and then you give at least 2 reasons, but we try to teach for 3 reasons. And then each one of these 3 reasons become a body paragraph. So this will become, reason 1 will become a topic sentence, and then you'll have 2 supporting details here where you pick out quotes from your writing, and then reason 2 will be a topic sentence. That will be body paragraph 2, and so on and so forth. And then we'll have body paragraph 3. And this goes here, this goes here, this goes here. And each of them will have 2 supporting details. And you have to use quotes from both articles. And then finally, you'll have a conclusion. So again, this is just a sample of the kinds of things that we offer because of course I can't, teach our whole class that overlies weeks into like 1 hour, but I'm just trying to sample the different types of questions that you guys can expect and the different ways that we prepare our students as we go forward. And in terms of the math, similar ideas. You have a mix of arithmetic type of questions where students just have to perform mathematical operations. You have some geometry involved. You have word problems as well. You have a set of multiple choice questions. And the multiple choice questions are then followed by a short answer as well, like this. And you always have to show your work for full credit. And then there's there's more like thought-provoking questions where it's not necessarily one specific answer choice or answer value. It's more like provoking the students to think about it, and then they have to explain it as well. Explain how they're thinking about it. More recently, they've been using a lot more 3-dimensional geometry. That wasn't the case a few years ago, but that's one direction that this test has moved in. As you can see, there are several questions that address that. So yeah, I want to leave time for questions. That was basically our general overview of 4th and 5th grade, because those were the parents that were present at the beginning of the webinar. The 3rd grade is very, very similar in terms of structure and the ways we teach, just at a little bit of a lower level because the content is simpler because the grade level is lower. So I hope this was useful. If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. You can put them in the chat. You can also just unmute yourself since we have a rather small group. And if you guys don't have any questions, that will mark the end of our webinar. It was lovely to meet all of you. I hope that you guys benefited, and I hope that you are able to enroll in Queller's classes in January. So again, I'm just gonna stay on in case there's any questions and give you guys a few minutes to think about it. And if nobody has any questions, then I will end the webinar in a few minutes. But you guys can stay put and just think and ruminate on a question. Again, either put it in the chat or just unmute yourself. And I'll be here. This webinar is also recorded. So hopefully you guys can rewatch it if you have any questions, and other people can also watch it. And these notes could also be made available if you request them. Bye, guys. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully this was helpful. Good night, everybody.